the second event that we do in the year. Earlier in April, we had another one about why vascular surgery. This one is more about the virtual interview, and it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Michael Amendola be our guest for this. He did this last year as well, and talked about how to create a vascular surgery interest group. Dr. Amendola is unique in that he's a Virginia person through and through. He went to William & Mary, went to VCU for med school, residency, and fellowship, and stayed on there to practice. He's currently the chief at the VA, and he's also the senior fellow for the VA Senior Innovation Fellow with the focus on 3D printing, and is the first program director for a 3D printing surgical fellowship. And so, unique individual, but I will say that the thing that's always caught my eye about Dr. Amendola is that every time you go to a meeting such as the VAM, he's there with like 15 students, and they all have posters that they're presenting. They're in the exhibit area, and he's taking them around and showing them around. And he's a person who has really figured out the secret sauce for the vascular surgery interest group, and it's a pleasure to have him again. So Michael, please take it away.
Then thank you very much. Let's see if I can share my slides. And are we good there? You guys see me? Okay. So the virtual interview, how is it different than in person? It is different than the in-person experience. Implications for vascular surgery training. So I'm Mike Amendola. I'm from VCU Medical School. I'm the chief of surgery at the VA. And my task today is to kind of talk about virtual interviewing, implications for our training programs. How is it different? How is it the same? I'm going to give some tips in this webinar, which you guys can take home in terms of making and optimizing your Zoom. Most of the tips are Zoom based. So this is just a disclosure slide saying I'm not representing the United States government, and all the views here are mine. So this was what happened to most of us. We were grabbed by COVID-19 in terms of changing what we traditionally always did in person and made it virtual. So I'm going to talk about what the new normal is. I'm going to talk about LEAFs, which is an acronym for looking at how we optimize online interfaces, open issues for virtual interviewing, the pathway forward, and then some take-home messages. So this is the new normal per the AAMC statement this past year for the 2022-23 cycle. All residency interviews should be conducted virtually. Even if applicants are local, it should be done virtually for those applicants to make them equivalent to those who cannot come or are going to be joining you virtually. They recommend against a hybrid approach, that is in-person versus virtual as well. Our own organization, so the APDS, the Vascular APDS statement says roughly the same, which should be conducted virtually. However, there's an APDS pilot trial program that allows programs to go ahead and virtually interview, but also provide applicants with the ability to come on site, but that's after the rank list has been submitted by that program to prevent a potential bias toward those who have the adequate resources to get there in person. So it's the new resume in a lot of ways, and this is a Forbes article here saying, the cost and the ease, utilization of the technology, more preparation in terms of being able to get your message across to others. But it's a natural progression from paper to in-person to now virtual. These are the stated kind of advantages for virtual interviewing, that being financially cheaper, less time away from school and work, fewer conflicting interviewing times, greater diversity in interviewers, fewer scheduling issues with interviewers. Pre-interview outreach is more available and accessible, and institutions, it forces them to have more of an online presence by virtue of interfacing with applicants in a virtual manner. And then it's also part of the introduction of telehealth that we've all lived through from the pandemic. In terms of disadvantages, it gets rid of that causal kind of casual interface that we have with trainees when they come to interview in our programs, decreased awareness of nonverbal cues and body language, natural conversation distorted in a lot of ways because you're online. Technical difficulties can be problematic. Loss of environmental standardization, i.e. background, for example, mine versus others. And then possibly new sources of bias, which I'll talk about toward the end of this talk. And then inability to kind of gain a knowledge of the actual program, to quote, feel out the program and see what it's like. So basically cut down here, in person is traditional, usually higher cost, established rules, known pathways, because we've been doing it for so long. It's an away game, i.e. those come and they interview with you. It's more formal in a lot of ways, and there's no real technology aside from that, which it takes to get you there. Virtually is the new pathway, minimal cost, evolving rules, changing rules as well as pathways, and it's a neutral ground. It's not an away game, it's not a home game, but it's at a third party stadium, and then it's informal, and there is a technological lift. I put this here to tell you that we have bad habits with our technology in terms of our phones, the way that we get our music from our phones, how we shop and send emails. We have almost in some ways a personal relationship with our devices. In a lot of ways that infers and goes into our virtual, the way that we interface potentially virtually. This is just a picture to remind me to say to you that a lot of times that we interface with our phones to capture personal moments and not necessarily formal events. So in some ways that might pepper, or that might end up flavoring the interfaces that we have using our devices in this way. So virtual interviewing is here to stay. The questions are how to do it better. How do we teach it, if you will? What are the factors, and how do we use it effectively? So what are leaves? Leaves are lighting, the eye contact, the audio, the framing, and the substance of the actual virtual interview. So in terms of the lighting, a 3-point setup, and this is, if you go to any YouTube, you can search this and it'll show you. But basically, you want to have some ambient light, 3-point lighting. Lighting can be from any source, and professional lighting is not a necessity when you're looking at online presence. This is a classic example of bad lighting, i.e., why is the laundry in the background? The lighting is so bad that the particular person blends in, and also he's offset. He's not in the center of the frame. So this is a zoom fail, if you will. This is another example of a zoom fail of someone kind of emerging from the light. Again, these are things that are very subtle, but they definitely can flavor your interface with people. The other thing on the picture on the right is a classic no-no, and having the blinds behind you, in terms of having ambient light come in from behind you. That is also will take away the characteristics of your face. This is just from Amazon, showing that you can buy simple lighting. This is a $16 light source that you can get, as well as some more professional lighting that's almost $35 here. In terms of eye contact, you want to have your computer up, and you want to have it. So currently, right now, I have my MacBook on top of Rutherford, as well as the Moore book as well, because I don't want to flavor this conversation to an East Coast or a West Coast, for those of you who understand the origins of both of those books. But you want to be looking at the camera, and ideally at eye level. Sometimes you can move the camera down. They do have cameras that will move down to the center of your screen. So it allows you to look at your content, but also engage the camera. You can actually do this too, which I've seen trainees do, which is say, look here, look at the camera, don't look down. Finally, a lot of times in Zoom, you see yourself. So sometimes you want to prevent yourself from being a distraction. So covering actually your screen will actually help you sometimes focus more on the camera and in the interface that you're going for. This is two examples of eye offline. So basically you're looking at both of these individuals in each of these cases. This is a classic. So this, if you Google or go to YouTube and say Zoom fails, this is on every video that you find. So this is Maxine Waters to the left from the House of Representatives. She is doing a live interview with another congressman that he was inverted like this with a virtual background. I put this in as a public service announcement on Zoom. If you go under the video segment and you go to the upper right and you just click that twice, it will take you from inverted, as you can see for me on the left in a common Starbucks, to the right where I'm upright. In terms of audio, internal microphones in most computers lack sound quality and consistency. They're relatively small. The MacBook Air, which I'm talking to you on right now, more advanced computers will actually have multiple microphones that will allow you to pinpoint sound, which gets rid of some of the limitations of previous computers. But the big thing here is a lot of times these microphones are limited, and it prevents sometimes one speaker from you'll get interruptions on the audio because it's picking up feedback. You can get audio online. This is a common microphone that you can get from Amazon. And these always, they plug in and they're actually pretty easy. There's multiple videos online of what are the top 10 microphones and lighting setups for any particular Zoom setup. In terms of the settings within Zoom, I put this in here. You want to, usually you can suppress your background noise. It can either be auto, low, medium, or high, and it will suppress the background noise. I will show you a paper eventually toward the end that talks about the implications of background sound in the midst of a virtual interview. Most people leave this on auto. In terms of music and in the professional settings, you want to click this and always have high fidelity music, noise, echo cancellation, and audio and stereo audio. And then finally, setting the actual volume within Zoom. Some sources say to do that, others say do not. You can set it within your individual computer, but I usually leave it on auto and it seems to do just fine. I put this picture here because you see this commonly on interviews where you'll see trainees use earphones. This is actually pretty interesting because I think in some ways it allows the trainee to listen to you and to have a better interface in terms of an audio. But there's an implication. If you walk down the street and saw this gentleman wearing earphones like this, you more than likely would not talk to him because you know he's trying to kind of seclude himself from the outer environment. That might have some implication in terms of the way that you interface with someone. So I always recommend the trainees not to wear earphones like this. In terms of the framing, you want to set up a professional profile on Zoom. This is mine here. You do that for a couple of reasons. One, it represents you when your camera is not on. Number two, it also, before you come into an individual chat room or into an individual Zoom, that you'll be in kind of a waiting room. It'll show you that. And then of course you can set your name as you want. And many times people put their pronouns in that setting as well. In terms of the initial video settings for Zoom, and this is one of the most surprising things that I learned from this lecture, preparing for this, is that when you turn on Zoom, the initial view that you see is that of HD. The reality is that Zoom usually reverts back to the lowest setting to put you onto the network, and that prevents bandwidth issues within their network. So just adjust it. Usually if you just click HD there, then usually it will stay within HD. There are other ways of doing that. And if you get onto YouTube and just search it, there's multiple kind of hacks within Zoom to do maximal HD. But if that said, most of the time, it's just fine to just click HD in terms of the Zoom setting. And then disable adjust for low light and touch up my appearance. Those are ways that kind of alter the light and the way the light fits onto your face. People play around with those settings all the time, but that's kind of up to you if you like those or not. But I recommend you to go in and see what your image looks like within Zoom. In terms of location within the frame, you want to definitely be in the center, as I am right now talking to you, but you can be offset if you'd like, but you should have something within the frame equidistant on the other side. You don't want to have it too plain. You don't want to have it too cluttered. You are the focus. So this is an example of too plain of a background for an interview. And in this case, just way too much going on in the background. Virtual backgrounds, I put this here. Some people love this and embrace this, want it and use it. Some others people say you shouldn't do it on an interview because it basically takes away attention from what you're saying and who you are to what's in the background. In this case, two birds. So I put that out there. It just depends on what your style is and what you're really trying to focus on. I put this here. This is a child that snuck into her mother's room in the midst of a BBC interview during the midst of the pandemic. Children want screen time too. So it's always advisable to try to keep children at least away from you during the interview, but always keep that in mind. And that goes for pets too. This is a classic example. And both of these are on if you just, again, on YouTube, search Zoom fails, you will see. And this cattail goes back and forth in the midst of this Zoom interview that was on TV. So you want to try to control your pets as well. In terms of waist up, remember, they are only seeing you from the waist up, but as you can see here, pants would be required, as can be seen here. And this gentleman was embarrassed because he did not have pants on. That said, you can see this as well, that pants are required probably for observers within your environment. So this kind of kicks to, you should always remember where you are what kind of environment you're in and how you're being interviewed. It's all part of the presentation of who you are. So you want to try to get as much professional setting as you can, including wearing pants when you interview. And then also remember that, being in the center, are you being interviewed or is the room being interviewed here? So I think getting the computer up close to you to interface with the person on the other side. And then this was an interesting thing that I also found is virtual social distancing. So in the midst of the pandemic, we learned social distancing and to maintain that, but also interfacing close within the camera might actually put people at discomfort because you're literally virtually too close to them in a kind of reaction that you would have if you were actually in person together. So something to consider and keep in mind when you interface online. And then this is actually from a website that looked at ideal makeup for in the midst of a Zoom. And their take was too much forehead is not a good thing. I leave that to your individual style and desires. So what's the substance of the interview? As known by many on this call, it's either one-to-one, group-based, or a virtual. We're talking about virtual interviewing in this case. And there could be multiple variants of this, where it occurs, how it occurs, how many groups, who's involved. And then in terms of the content, agenda-based, interviews where the interviewers done it that way for the same way for many, many years. They direct the points and the questions, not agenda, which is more of a free form conversation. I've heard of other people saying, okay, you interview me. That'll get you to learn about the person that you're sitting down with. And then structured, either behavioral based, internal, institutional based questions, and then other formats. In terms of behavioral basis, I put this here because I give this talk to medical students. This is a common acronym to attack behavioral based questions, of which you see to the left here in blue. Is something in the past, is something you're really excited about? Tell me about a project where your teammate was not pulling her weight. What did you do? So I tell trainees, you want to basically detail the background. What is the situation? The task would describe the challenge and the expectation, what action you took to help get over that task, and then what was the result and what did you learn from it? So the STAR acronym is, I think, important. I think it's also important when we interview trainees or anyone, quite frankly, with behavioral based questions, we give them permission to think. And I tell that to all my trainees and also people who interview with our program is, I'm going to ask you a question that you will not know the answer to right off the bat. It's going to take you a second and you might need a couple minutes to kind of process this. We can even come back to this question and you can tell me something. So giving the person some time and permission to think about what they're doing. This is the ideal quote unquote setup for a virtual interview. As you can see here, the computer, I talked about the eye leveling, the microphone. You want to have a mouse. So usually you want to have a mouse that's off and not centered on your computer, where you will shake your computer when you move to the next slide. And then also a phone if you have to interface with someone in terms of getting the interview going, and then external microphone if you like as well. In terms of technology control, I think it makes the best sense to always jump on to make sure your product is up to date. Make sure you understand the platform, how to interface with the platform, and then all the platforms have tests that you can run to make sure your microphone as well as your video is working appropriately for the presentation. This is a setup from one of my trainees. This is his camera on top of his computer. This is his setup here, and you can see behind is the large computer where he had a series of questions that he had already written out answers to and had prepared for this particular program interview. The front computer is the actual Zoom or the interview. Then he has notes that he's making in the midst of this. So you can see there's multiple. And then, of course, the obligatory monster drink, which all trainees need when they're interviewing. So what are the open issues in terms of virtual interviewing and, quite frankly, in-person interviewing? So I'm going to run through some of this is going to be based out of the medical literature. Some of this is going to be based out of the psychological literature. It's some interesting concepts and ideas and things for you to think about, especially when you're interviewing people. So auditory mimicry or miming or mirroring either behaviors or auditory or feedback from one person to another is a common thing in psychology. This is a study from the Netherlands. It's pretty fascinating. They went to an established restaurant and they basically told the waitress, we are studying mimicking, meaning when you take an order, we want you to read the order exactly back to the person ordering. And then they did a second study in the same restaurant with a different set of waitresses where they didn't tell the waitress why she was doing that. And they basically said they measured the amount of tips that people gave if they read back the order or they didn't. So on the left, you can see mimicking them. You can see on the left is scale is the actual tips. So you can see, and these are significant amount of tips for those who mimicked versus those who did not. And then in the second study with the baseline, even from the baseline to non-mimicking, i.e. telling the waitress not to read it back, there was still significance. So in some ways, how we echo back what's told to us, either in person and more than likely online in terms of the auditory feedback, has some element of influence in the way that we interface with people. This is the physical memory. So this is the actual movements within, and this was based on a virtual setting. So this is avatars with a 3-second delay. So basically mimicking, it usually occurs within a 2 to 5 second time period. And they did an initial screening of roughly 40 people to figure out which people figured out that they were actually being mimicked by the avatar. And it was a conversation between you and the avatar. The avatar would learn your behaviors and mimic that back to you. And the question was, did you have some affiliation or any kind of, what was your impression of the avatar? In particular, rapport was the one thing being studied. So this is the setup here, and you can see the avatars being projected. They're following the participant, and they're measuring the way the participant's moving. And then the avatar calculates that and then mimics that behavior back to the person talking to them. So this is a pretty good study. And they also actually set up the avatars. These are some examples of the avatar here. They set up the avatars with multiple ethnicities and skin tones, so they would try to reduce the amount of bias that people potentially brought in based on their interface or their unconscious bias in terms of interfacing with the avatar. What was interesting is rapport was actually higher when they were mimicked than when they weren't mimicked. But there was no effect on other things such as, do you trust the avatar, and other smoothness of the interaction. So it possibly states that, there might be some effect of the way that we behave and how we're mimicked might have some interaction. This is classic in the sales literature and in the business literature as well, in terms of classic findings for cold calling, in terms of getting rapport very quickly with someone to make a sell. So what's the literature on the medicine side? So this is a paper from the plastic surgery literature. This was just published 2 weeks ago, looking at plastic surgery residents' perceptions of the virtual interview cycle. This was roughly a 27% response rate, and trying to measure the perceived benefits and disadvantages of the virtual interviewing. This is a picture of which we all know and understand, and inherently makes sense to us. So along the bottom are the total number of programs that a particular individual got accepted to. So if they got accepted to all 45 programs on the far right, what's in red are the number that they dropped out of those interviews. And as you could figure, if you're accepted to all of the programs, you're going to probably drop out of some of those interviews, while as those to the left were less likely to drop out of those interviews. This shows you their perception, or interviewees' perception of virtual interviewing. So basically, if it's flavored to the left, there's a disadvantage, or they didn't feel that there was any real reason to do virtual interviewing, i.e. a negative impression of virtual interviewing. To the right, a positive. If it's balanced between the two, then there's kind of a neutral. And as you can see, in terms of their perceived strengths of the process, their ability to showcase themselves, roughly equivalent. But in terms of their ability to figure out if they fit into the program, virtual interviewing failed. Ability to figure out the culture of virtual interviewing failed. And then the weakness within the individual programs, again, applicants felt like virtual interviewing did not give them that. This is one of the only studies I've seen that actually looks at how they prepared for virtual interviewing. So in looking at the lighting, the webcam, the microphone, the upgraded internet, the plants, or even other decorations, the internal circle shows you how many of them actually did something. The outer circle is after the end of the interview cycle, did they get value out of it? So most of them all got lighting, and most all of them have felt like that was a worthwhile thing. Webcam was the second, with most all of them thinking that it was worthwhile. In terms of orthopedics, so this is from March, is March 2021. This looked at orthopedic program directors. So how did the program directors feel about this? And this is roughly a 28% response rate. And again, perceptions of virtual interviewing. And then again, the same kind of scale here. If to the left, they disagreed. If to the right, they agreed. And you can see overall better than in-person interviews. Most program directors did not agree. Made selection committee rely heavily on the objective metrics of the assessment? Absolutely. They were more likely to rely on things that were not part of the interviewing process. Made it easy for the applicants to commit to the specialty, or their ability to perceive that commitment? No effect. Made it easier for the applicant's personality and communication skills and assess that? No effect. Made it easier to assess if the applicant fit in? No effect. Allowed candidates to be more candidates be interviewed? Yeah, it's pretty middle down the road. Less time consuming, again, down the road, and was definitely less expensive, roughly in this study about $3,000 to $5,000 cheaper. In terms of gel surgery program directors, this is a study out now looking at this has now had some time on it. So this is 2020, 2021. Again, roughly a 20% response rate. This shows you basically the 8 questions, and in red arrows here, you can see, was it less expensive? Yeah, it was less expensive to do virtual interviewing. Was it less time consuming? Not necessarily. Did it allow more candidates to be interviewed? Yeah, probably did. Was it more easy to assess their fit with the program? No. Was it easy for the applicant to assess their communication skills? No. Did it make it easier for to assess the applicant's commitment to the specialty? Kind of neutral across the board. And did it help the selection committee more likely to rely on objective data, i.e. not the interview? Yes. And then finally, was it an overall experience? And you can see there it was pretty much neutral. So there's a developing literature in terms of what's the value of virtual interviewing. And one of the perceived values is the ability to mitigate financial hurdles, as well as issues and with diversity and inclusivity for our applicants. So this just shows you here in terms of the key findings of the recommendations in terms of minimizing bias in reviews and evaluations. Virtual interviewing, i.e. recording what we do, would more than likely, with appropriate oversight, could help us mitigate biases, not only within ourselves, but within our fellow faculty or within our departments. And it's something to think about, especially with this particular type of interviewing. So really, what's the role? What's the balance between the virtual interview compared to other sources of information and within our training programs? Most all of you read The Vascular Specialist, and you probably read this, and this is from Mal Sheehan about a year ago from LSU. So his statement here is, the overconfidence in our expertise and experience leads us to cling to a broken system that is interviewing. And unstructured interviews not only are ineffective, but they're also a perfect environment for our implicit biases to run amok. So I think he really pushed the question of, why are we interviewing? Do we even really need to do that? And it was more so in this article for unstructured versus structured interviewing or behavioral based interviewing, for example. So how are we doing in vascular? Most all of you are familiar with this. This is a West Coast paper, but also with Don Coleman, formerly of the University of Michigan, now at Duke, looking at basically the 73 students who matched into vascular surgery in 2020. This was an anonymous survey trying to probe the experience, the post-interview communication, and the gender-based differences. This shows you between males and females, there was no significant difference in terms of their age, education, medical degrees, if their institution had a training program. What was shocking when this was presented at the Society for Clinical Vascular 2 years ago was that roughly 50% of females were asked an inappropriate question about their marital status or relationship status, as well as 24% of all men. Additionally, pregnancy plans were also asked of roughly 17% of all females that interviewed. So this just kind of shows that inappropriate questions are being asked on the interview as captured in this survey. And I think this is definitely something that virtual interviewing might be able to mitigate this particular bias in the way that we are interfacing with applicants. So in terms of OMFS, this is a paper that predates the pandemic. So this is in-person interviewing, again, an anonymous survey and roughly 14% response rate. Again, looking at the attitudes of in-person interviewing. The bias here is that this was actually of all residents that were in training at OMFS residencies or training programs. So this is not necessarily right after they did the interview. So there might be some bias in terms of what their recall was in terms of the interview. But you can see here that roughly 27% of men and roughly 44% of women were asked about their relationship status. Again, program, a clear violation of the rules for interviewing. And so there's a developing literature here in terms of biases in terms of our trainees. So virtual interviews might also introduce new biases, but might actually amplify existing biases. And this is actually a paper that kind of talks through a potential structure of where virtual interviewing might be not be in the best interest of those who are applying to programs. I put this study up here. This is I call it the technological advantage. So this is a study that looked at 4 individual actors, and these were videos. They were applying for a job, and then they were assessed. The actual videos all had high fidelity, and then the videos were actually altered using a video altering kind of program to either add in AV or jumps in the camera or background sounds to see if that affected the way that people assess these particular videos or these applicants in terms of hiring them. So they put them in 2 groups of those that were fluent and those that were disfluent. Okay. Looking at the disfluent, so those that had AV issues were more statistically less desirable or likely to be hired. And as follow-up study, when they told raters, you cannot rate them based on the way the camera looks or the sound, they still were less likely to be rated for a job and were less desirable and it was more statistically significant. So it's a pretty interesting study in terms of that. I put this here because I think there's something to the technological aspect of how we interface. But in terms of diversity and inclusivity, one of the potential issues would be if you have individuals who have come from lower socioeconomic settings, they might not be able to have the technology to interface in a higher technological way online in virtual interviewing, which might carry a bias against them. So that is kind of the take home in terms of thinking about, I think this and some other authors agree with me in terms of the impressions. So what's the pathway forward? I think right now we live in the synchronous interviewing world, meaning you ask a question, I answer it, I ask a question, you answer it back and forth. So that's a synchronized or virtual interview or a video interviewing. Asynchronous interviewing might be a potential answer to this, whereas as a program director, you set up and you ask 15 questions, maybe behavioral based questions. Individuals can record their answers to those questions, or it can be a timed where you ask in a program, then they have 30 seconds to answer that's recorded and then is sent to you. And then you get to grade that. So that asynchronous component of this might be part of the pathway forward in terms of how we deal with virtual interviewing. And then I put this in there, the metaverse. The metaverse is possibly, it's among us, it's here. With Justin Bieber and Snoop both having major concerts in the metaverse in the last couple of months, and people selling land in the metaverse. We eventually will learn in the metaverse. We will probably interface with those who want to train within our specialty within metaverse. So where that fits in, I think is going to be a component of this as well. And then finally, the AAMC has put some research questions. Their site is actually pretty good. It talks about the fairness, the validity, and the psychometrics in terms of virtual interviewing, the implications for recruiting, applicant preparation, what applicants potentially are or not doing in terms of virtual interviewing, program uses and reactions, and then finally the costs. And I suggest that you go to the AAMC website. There's very good literature there to support a lot of these current questions, these research questions that I think will be part of what we see in the future in terms of virtual interviewing. So the take home message is there is some low hanging fruit there. There's some basic things that you can do to optimize the way that you interface online. I think you ought to do that, but be careful how you don't fall into bad habits with technology and don't bring that into the virtual environment, especially in a formal setting such as an interview. The new communication format, we have integrated virtual communications now almost in everything that we do as surgeons, as educators as well. It's a pattern of work and play that's been altered because of the pandemic, but it's now kind of the coin of the realm of how we interface. And then, life moves fast, and the virtual interview fits into our paces as surgeons in particular because of the ability to remove some of the logistical hurdles that we've always had because of our practices to be able to gather information from our trainees. And then finally, the ultimate question is what's the value? I think that has yet to be determined in terms of in-person versus other programs, and then implies what are the measures that we can do. Finally, I leave you with this picture. This is from the VAM this past year. This was the medical student section that I chaired with Cherie Wright from the University of South Carolina. These are basically 3/4 of the students that stayed after to ask questions. So we have a population of learner that wants to interface with us. We have to, I think, figure out what's the ideal way to do it. Virtual interviewing more than likely will be part of that formula, but we have to do it correctly. We have to do it with a lot of thought. And then I think we have to figure out how we get other lifts as it pertains to trainee engagement. Thanks very much again to the Western for the ability to speak, and happy to take any questions.
Michael, that was fantastic as always, and much appreciated. And I feel like when you're going through all of those things, I feel like I failed on several of them as far as my virtual interview. I got to play background. Exactly, I got a little angle going here. So I started sitting up a little straighter during the thing. I really appreciate it. I do think that there is a lot to it, right? You only have one chance to make a first impression. And if, as you said, if it's a virtual impression, that these are things that you look at. And so it is very interesting that you say that. And, one of the things that's getting presented at the Western is I was on the issues committee, chair of the issues committee at APDVS. And one of the annual training survey was about the perception of virtual interviews among our trainees. And we had a 31% response rate. And, when we look at it, the biggest thing that was a benefit was the cost savings. And I think that's reiterated everywhere, right? And, but interestingly, when we asked the trainees, 91% felt that they wouldn't have an equal opportunity if they were given a virtual interview, offered a virtual interview or an in-person interview.
Right.
And they would opt for the in-person interview because they just felt like they would have a better chance of matching at that program or better outcome, which is still interesting. And one of the things that I found that was, when you were talking about how they upgraded, we asked them about the difficulties with it. And 60% said that they had an inability or difficulty finding a quiet place to do this. I think 44% said they had to upgrade their Wi-Fi.
Right.
And 38% said they needed to upgrade their computer equipment. So, there's a cost to it from that standpoint, but the cost savings, I think, is still remarkable. And, what's your impression on it? It's institution dependent, right? I mean, we can say that the AAMC says this. Most places will follow what the AAMC says. Some places will say you're allowed to do an interview. Our institution says everything's going to be virtual. And, we have to follow our institution guidelines. So what do you think the future is on that?
Yeah, so the plastics paper was interesting. So the average cost there that those learners paid was roughly $500 on average that they paid for upgrades. So either new computers, microphones, or lighting. As I said, the webcam and the lighting were the key things. I think the question really is, when are we going to get to a equivalent state like we are right now? So for example, your conferences are probably virtual and in person. At least ours are. In some ways, they are somewhat considered equivocal. Right. But in some ways, I think there's still a value in program. I think people interviewing are saying there's a greater value if you come and see me in the place and in the culture. You're going to be able to fit in here. Now, Sheehan makes a huge argument that, what are we really doing here? Are we just pushing our biases onto people that we are interviewing to say, hey, you're like me, so therefore I'm going to rate you higher. I think we need to evolve in terms of what we're interfacing with our trainees. And in some ways, maybe the interview is not the ideal place. I put that picture of us in the operating room. That's where we enter. That's what we teach the majority of the time as surgeons. Why am I in a suit talking to you on an interview? I mean, what are we really talking about? So I think we need to evolve in terms of how we interface. And part of that is, the language, kind of coin of the realm also, I think, for trainees and also for program directors is the letters that are written. And I try to take a fair amount of time to put language in there to say to you, hey, this is someone who can talk to you in a clinical room. This is someone who can handle an emergency, things that you will not necessarily get to in the interview. So figuring out how to integrate all of that together is going to be part of this. And I think the virtual interview and the metaverse might be part of that solution coming up.
That's great. We're going to be wearing goggles and interviewing them.
Well, and Elon Musk has commented on it. He said, until we figure out how to do it without goggles, it's not going to work. But, as Facebook has now put a significant amount of capital behind the metaverse. And there are a lot of people buying. Now, I will tell you that speculation and perceived value, as most people live through the Bitcoin.com boom bust or whatever you want to call it. So that's the next kind of question is what exactly is going on in the metaverse? How do we interface within it?
Okay. All the participants, anybody, please feel free to enter questions into the chat. And, I'll ask the co-panelists, Dr. Maggie or Banyan, if they have any other questions as of right now. So
I think the question I have for the panel is, how are you guys doing? How are you dealing with local interviews? So your own medical students, are you doing it virtually? As existential as that might be, they might be literally in the next room and you're talking to them on an interface, or are you doing it in person?
I can answer that. We did ours virtually as well. So they could very well be in the room next door, but we felt it was necessary to put them on an even footing.
Yeah.
What do you guys do?
We're the same way. We're completely virtual.
Yeah, at UW we have to. Even local applicants are interviewed virtually. That's just the way it works because it's an unfair advantage if they're able to do it in person. As you said, you probably know them. You probably know the local people, but you have to interview virtually.
And I think there's a faculty development value there, right? In terms of figuring out how to kind of put everybody along that kind of put all the ducks in a row here and say, okay, this is how the interview ought to go. And even when behavioral based questioning, there's studies that show individuals go to those particular places for behavioral based studying. There's a lot of interviewers that go off script. So trying to keep faculty members on script to say, okay, these are the questions we're going to ask. This is what we've placed a value in terms of assessment of what's going on of this particular trainee or future potential trainee.
It makes you wonder, is the value of a sub-I becoming more and more, important? And is there a disadvantage to people who don't, or is there an unfair advantage to people who get to do sub-Is at the institution because you get a little, usually they have an advantage, but then now it's like even more critical because they're getting that quality one-on-one time that a virtual applicant's not even going to come close to getting.
Right. So I think that's part of the question. Are we just taking it now and we put everybody on even footing in a virtual interview? Now we've made it somewhat biased now that those people, can come along, So, and I think I think you're right, in terms of, so that's the ultimate, and I get that a lot is, are we doing in person? Are they doing virtual, virtual AI? So I think that's the other component of this.
What's interesting is that, during the survey we had too, one of the things they said is that they felt like they couldn't gauge the interaction between faculty and trainees, right? Which I think is true, right? I mean, most places, I'm sure that Leanne and Greg, when you guys had residency fellowship interviews, you have a reception the night before, people are all there, you're interacting, you're getting to talk to them in a casual kind of environment. And they get to see interactions. And you get to see interactions. And I personally think that's important because I do think that it shows people what you're about. And not necessarily, it's not stilted as an interview, but I do think that some of those things we do lose with with the virtual. I understand all of the benefits, and I know you can't put the toothpaste back into the tube after it's already done. So it's going to be hard to go back to saying we're going all into in-person interviews. But it's I do think there is something that's lost, and maybe I'm a little bit, maybe my generation now is starting to say that something's lost. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure how the others feel about that.
Well, and I also think just from an applicant's perspective, as we go into this new era where there's a lot more females, there's, everything is family friendly. Everyone's encouraged to have families and to, saying you can do this in surgery now. You can have a family, you can have children. It becomes really important to know what city you're going to be living in for the next, 2 to 5 years, whether you're in fellowship or residency. So do you miss out on that opportunity to know where am I going to be putting my kids, my husband, my wife, my family for the next X number of years? Do I want to see the city and hang out for 48 hours?
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of interviewers trip up, is they want to provide that information in a non-biased way. So a lot of times the way I get around that is I say, we have had several trainees in the past that have had significant others that need specialized jobs. We have multiple institutions here in Richmond that allow for that. So it speaks to it in a theoretical, and it doesn't speak to it of, do you have a significant other? Do they need a job? I mean, so I think I think that's what peppers, I think, a lot of these kind of quote inappropriate questions is faculty members trying to get information across. And in terms of the social thing, then I agree with you. And I think I found, and I think maybe I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts, but it was a nice thing because it made faculty actually stand around and have a beer together and have a drink. And so it was, in some ways, it was a nice way to see the whole department or division together doing something socially, because you had trainees there that you were interfacing with. So, but yeah, so how do you do that virtually? That's the question. We have data out from the VAM this past year with Annie Lou, one of our medical students, that looked at the tours on YouTube. And what we found, what was interesting, was most of the time, a lot of the data that was in the tours were things that people want to hear about, which are things like social interactions, interfaces with residents. So a lot of that information comes out on the tours when they're not necessarily saying, hey, this building was built in X by Y for this reason Z, but there's other information there. So how do we get that engagement? And the metaverse might be part of that solution moving forward.
And I was going to agree with everybody else and say, I was going to say the same thing, which is that I think it's a big loss, not going to a place, not seeing people in person, not being at the, the event the night before. It really changes your experience, and it changes, how you see people interacting, which I think is what really people are looking for in the interview. That's the purpose of the interview, really, largely.
Right.
Do you want to be around these people,
right,
for a long period of time? And I also don't think that, we have, I'm sure you guys have something similar where there's a breakout room where when the applicants are not, in the middle of interviews with the faculty members, they're able to speak with the residents or trainees. But I think a lot of times they don't feel confident about asking, sensitive questions in that environment because they don't know who else is going in and out of that room.
Right.
And versus in person, there's nobody else in the room.
Right.
And so I think that's the big loss. I'm actually not 100% certain it's going to stay like this. I think that there's a demand for people to have this. And I think that, industries are starting to go back to the office, and I wouldn't be surprised if, in a couple of years, people are going back to in-person interviews.
Yeah.
But Nikabu Kabuti from Irvine has a question on any thoughts on or points on hosting virtual happy hours prior to the interview date. Has anyone been doing that?
We did ours. We gave Grubhub gift cards and had like a virtual happy hour the day before that the faculty actually wasn't present for. The residents came in and they were allowed to interact, and they got a lot of good feedback from it. They seem to enjoy it. I mean, it's as good as you could get virtually, basically.
Yeah. So there's actually a lot of literature online to how to construct these, how to get engagement, social engagement, and it's a happy hour. So there's drinking games, and I've been to meetings that have had that, which I think is pretty interesting. I've been to virtual meetings where there's actually a virtual space and you have to actually walk into to the exhibit hall and sit down or to the lecture hall and sit down and listen to a talk, and you can get up and you can go talk to someone else and say, hey, who are you? So that kind of engagement to physically see a figure close to another figure where you can interface with them, that might get over some of that. But I agree with you. There's something to that social kind of construct of seeing other people. Do these people get along? Do they talk? Do they not talk? Who's here? Who's not here? So I think those are all data points that trainees are gathering when they interview, where they used to interview in person.
Yeah, we do something very similar. I mean, we used to, we give our talks about the program that night, and then the faculty fade away, and it's just the trainees and the applicants. And the applicants say we don't ask them what they talk about, but they said they got good questions and questions about the program, and people feel a little more free to talk in that environment, and I think you got to do something to try to get that socialization out of there too, because you got to remember it now. I mean, it's not just 2 years. I mean, if it's a fellowship, you can go stand on your head for 2 years, but somebody's going somewhere for 5 to 7 years. I mean, that's, and they have a family or
right
and other things. That's a big commitment, and it's good for them to get that interaction or understand what's going on.
Yeah. And I think the lift is higher there, right? So you're trying to really figure out who fits, right? And in some way you lose a trainee when you have 6 trainees in a program or 5 trainees in a program. That's a 20% loss. That's a big problem. Whereas the fellows kind of, I think they kind of get it. I think you're right. They can do almost anything for 2 years, but a 5-year lift is a bigger lift.
Yeah, and also that the 5+2 people have already done it once, right? They've already gone through general surgery, so they kind of know the game, and they've chosen to take an extra couple of years. So I think that there's a little difference there in terms of their experience.
Yeah,
and
that's
tolerance.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the double AMC questions is those who go on to fellowship who initially interviewed in person in terms of their residency, what is their experiences of one versus the other in terms of kind of looking at the difference that they feel because they're going on to a fellowship that's more virtual in nature. But, it's an evolving literature. I think, again, it has a lot of opportunity for faculty development, especially how we interface. But again, this is a moving target. And I agree with you. People are hungry to get back in person. They really are. At the national meetings, you see it. I saw it at PNEC when I was there. I think that a lot of people want to get back and physically be together.
Yep, Leanne saw that at VAM and then got COVID.
Yeah.
For sharing that.
There might be a cost.
Calling you out.
I think that's protected health information.
I don't know. Leanne, you need to change your laundry so you can see in the background of Leanne. So the laundry, so you're focused on things in the background. So that's another.
I will tell you, I'm inappropriately aware of my forehead now after your talk. So
your forehead technically should just touch the top of the screen. It's okay. I have a partner who always does that. So it's okay to have I
will tell you though that after last year's webinar, I went and got myself one of these ring lights. So
yeah. Definitely. It's actually really good. And it's very cheap. And there's a whole, it's amazing what's out there, especially about YouTube. Yeah. YouTubers are big on how you film at home. What do you do? That kind of stuff. But these are some basic tips. The Zoom, I just went through Zoom because I think it's the most common platform, but their team seems to be a little bit more constricted in what you can and can't do. And then some of the other platforms are not nearly as diverse as Zoom, but Zoom definitely has some settings on it that allow you to change the quality. So it's something to think about.
Yeah, it's a problem with the forehead when it seems to be getting bigger and bigger. And,
and brighter and brighter.
And you're undergoing a remodel, so I could be in a closet for all we know right now. So I could be in some apartment without some sparse furniture. But I think this has been wonderful, and Michael, again, thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time and doing this again. And I don't see any other questions from the participants, but again, lots of things, useful information for us and everyone else, and we really appreciate you taking the time and making the effort to be here. So it's always good to see you too, my friend.
Always good to see you. Everybody be safe, and again, thanks to the Western for the invitation. And think about, there are a lot of great East Coast applicants, as Niten knows, medical students from VCU and elsewhere that'll be applying for your jobs or applying for your position. So please keep us in mind. And thanks, and hope to see everybody on the national circuit, and please be safe.
Thanks.
All right,
Mike.
Michael.
Keep sending
Good to
love.
see you guys. All right. Thank you guys very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.